I still remember the first headline: a body found near the Green River south of Seattle. Then another, and another. A quiet man kept driving the same roads, passing the same signs, smiling the same neighborly smile. Years later, we learned his name: Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. I open my diary and write his name slowly: Gary Leon Ridgway. To his neighbors, he was an ordinary man in a modest house near Seattle. He worked steady hours at a truck factory as a spray painter. He mowed his lawn, waved at neighbors, and drove a pickup that blended into the endless traffic. No one knew that inside this ordinary life, something dark was hiding in plain sight. Ridgway was born in 1949, raised in the Seattle-Tacoma area. Teachers called him quiet and slow-speaking. Friends remembered a boy who struggled with school, especially reading. At home, discipline was strict. Outside, he seemed invisible. As he grew, church and work gave him routines. He married more than once. He read the Bible. He asked strangers if they knew Jesus. He wanted to look good, sound good, appear good, but beneath that careful mask lived a different hunger. His job at the Kenworth truck plant gave him a predictable schedule and access to industrial paint. Tiny specks of that paint, years later, would become their own kind of fingerprint. His preferred routes ran along Pacific Highway South, past motels and diners, near street corners where the most vulnerable stood, young women and girls trying to survive the night. The same headlights, the same turn signals, the same soft voice, offering a ride. Seattle in the early 1980s was growing fast. Boeing shifts, blue-collar diners, rain that settled into everything. The Green River curved like a quiet witness. The airport roared nearby, and highways stitched the suburbs together. In that hum of engines and neon signs, people could disappear without anyone noticing right away. Some victims were teenagers, many were sex workers, some were runaways. They were targeted precisely because they were easy to overlook, and that truth still hurts to write. Ridgway's life looked stable. Long employment, regular paychecks, ordinary chores. He had a wife who believed in his kindness, co-workers who found him dependable, neighbors who saw a man who kept to himself. He sometimes lectured about morality and sin, even as he drove the same roads where temptation and danger lived side by side. The contradiction is jarring, but the pattern would become familiar. A public face of order, a private landscape of control. I close this page knowing what comes next. The setting is drawn. A quiet man, a busy region, a river that keeps its own secrets. The next lines in my diary will not just list names and dates. They will show how fear gathered slowly, one missing person report at a time, until it broke open by the water's edge, and the city understood it was living beside a serial killer. And because this page ends at the riverbank, the next begins, at the same wet stones, where a single discovery becomes a pattern. I turn the page and keep the river in view. The first bodies were found in 1982 near the Green River. A cluster of scenes, close to each other, told a story the city did not want to hear. These were not isolated tragedies. They were connected by the same quiet hand. Detectives marked the maps. They circled spots along Highway 99 and back roads near the river. They matched missing person reports to recovered remains. Much of the early evidence felt like whispers: tire tracks half lost in mud, fibers on clothing, ligature marks that suggested control and patience. The victims included young women and girls, some barely old enough to drive, some with families, who had been searching for months. At first, everything looked chaotic. Too many missing, too many rumors, not enough firm ground to stand on. But then one detail began to repeat. Many victims had last been seen near the same stretches of road, under the same neon signs, near the same motels and diners. The pattern didn't shout. It tapped on the door again and again, until the detectives had to open it. At first, Investigators wondered if they were chasing more than one killer. But then evidence began to stack. Quiet, consistent, relentless. A task force formed. Tips flooded in. The media named him the Green River Killer. Fear spread through Seattle and the South County suburbs. Women who worked those streets told each other which cars to avoid, which faces felt wrong, which promises always sounded the same. The community wanted answers, and the task force promised to find the man behind the wheel. Ridgway kept driving. He knew the rhythm of the streets, the moments when police were busiest, the places where headlights didn't hang around. He offered rides. He sounded soft, reasonable. He barely raised his voice. He blended in. That was his weapon. The diary line I write next is plain but heavy. Disappearances turned into discoveries, and discoveries turned into a pattern the city could no longer ignore. I keep the pen moving without lifting it. The task force put up boards, names, dates, locations, string pulled between photographs like nerves. Members rotated in and out. Some officers saw more scenes in a month than most see in a career. A few investigators carried those maps in their heads for years. At first, police leaned hard on witness descriptions and routine stops, but a different kind of clue, small, stubborn, patient, was quietly waiting on the victims themselves. Fibers, tiny paint spheres, microscopic evidence that laughed at time. The spray painting process at Ridgway's factory left specific layers of colored spheres, chemically unique enough to narrow a source. Those spheres stuck to clothing like invisible snow. Years later, they would matter more than anyone imagined. Even as detectives followed the science, they followed the man. Ridgway was interviewed early, then waved off. He passed polygraphs. He stayed bland. He acted helpful. He kept his roots, his truck, his low voice. He went back home and ate dinner as the news talked about a killer who was still out there. The community learned new habits. Women worked in pairs or left plate numbers with friends. Volunteers combed brushy banks. Families posted flyers, waited by phones, and walked every mental mile between hope and the worst answer. A city is not just streets and signs, it's a web of promises that you'll come home. When those promises break, the whole place feels colder. I pause and add a line that pulls me forward. The river kept its secrets, but it couldn't keep all of them. And the next pages will step from the riverbank into the road, following the truck, the turnouts, and the moments that became the heart of the case. I don't skip a beat. I step into the truck's shadow. Ridgway worked steady hours and used them like cover. He cruised familiar corridors, Pacific Highway South Side, streets, lots behind old businesses, small patches of woods near the Green River and the airport. He targeted those with the least protection. Teens far from home, women without stable shelter, those whose work forced them to trust rides from strangers to survive. He followed a pattern of approach that sounded boring on purpose. Ordinary questions, ordinary offers, ordinary tone. Boredom lowers the guard. A hand on the passenger door. A promise of cash. A quick ride. Some never made it back. At first, each scene looked isolated, a tragedy explained by risk and chance. But then the scenes started echoing one another, and the echo grew louder than the excuses. Victims were often found outdoors, near water, in wooded patches, off rural spurs. Sometimes clothes were missing. Sometimes stones were placed, oddly, deliberate, as if the scene needed the killer's signature to feel complete to him. The killings themselves were controlled and personal, hands, ligatures, a patience that required calm. He chased the feeling of power, then drove away and acted as if nothing had happened. I keep writing because the years didn't stop. Through the mid-1980s, bodies appeared in clusters, then lulls, then clusters again. The task force cataloged every artifact, every fiber, every thread. New detectives joined. Old detectives retired. The killer kept aging too, but age didn't blunt method. He was a creature of habit, and habit hides well. Ridgway's private life stayed surprisingly steady. Work, relationships, houses, church, talk. He sometimes preached judgment at the very people he targeted later at night. The contradiction is hard to hold in one hand, but it's real. A man can recite virtue at noon and hunt the vulnerable by midnight. At first, investigators assumed that time would help. Patterns usually harden with years. But this pattern disguised itself as everyday life, and everyday life looks harmless until you know where to look. The Green River case became a presence in Seattle, like a cold wind that never quite left. Families went to vigils. Journalists kept the names alive. Advocates demanded better protections for those who worked the streets because they could feel the shape of the hunter in the system's gaps. I underline the next part because the science finally caught up. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, DNA analysis improved drastically. Evidence from the early years, carefully preserved, was tested again with new methods. The results didn't shout, they pointed. In 2001, DNA from several victims matched Gary Ridgway. At the same time, those tiny paint spheres from the truck, plant, chemically layered like tree rings, linked his work environment to particles found on some victims. The case that felt like fog for 2 decades started to form a face. At first, the name looked like a possibility among many, but then each lab result and each micro-clue tightened the circle until it closed around one man. Ridgway was arrested in November 2001. The quiet spray painter who'd passed polygraphs and shrugged through interviews was led away in handcuffs. The roads he'd driven for years watched him go, and for the first time, the city felt the wind shift. I finished the page with a line that opens the next. The arrest was not the end. It was the doorway into the deepest rooms of the investigation. I turn the diary page and sit with the evidence tables. Detectives laid out swabs, fiber cards, photographs, soil samples, and those stubborn microspheres of paint. The DNA links were strong, multiple victims tied to the same man. The paint chemistry made a bridge from the factory to the victims. Clothing. The map of scenes, the timing of disappearances, the known patrols of his pickup, all of it started to overlap like transparent sheets, lining up into one image. Interviews began again. This time, small memories mattered. A coworker's comment about paint dust, a neighbor's recollection of late-night returns, a partner's impression of a man who knew back roads too well. The case was a mosaic. Every tessera counted. At first, the team feared the years had washed too much away. But some evidence doesn't age. DNA keeps its story, and science learns new ways to listen. Ridgway faced the facts with something colder than denial. Over time, he began to cooperate, not as a man confessing from guilt, but as a man bargaining for life. Prosecutors weighed options: the death penalty versus complete accounting. The community wanted truth and names. Families wanted to bring daughters home. Justice needed certainty. In 2003, Ridgway pled guilty to 48 counts of aggravated murder to avoid the death penalty. And later, another conviction was added, bringing his official total to 49. In exchange, he agreed to help locate remains, identify scenes, and fill in the missing questions. He took investigators to places he remembered: ditches, thickets, bends in the road, places that had looked innocent to every passerby. At first, people hoped cooperation would mean closure. But closure in a case like this is not a door that slams shut. It's a light that brightens slowly, name by name. The investigation became a long, careful walk through memory and terrain. Some families finally received answers after decades. Others received only the faint outline of a location, and almost a maybe. Not every question found its end, but many did. Prosecutors read the names in court, dozens of them, and the room held its breath. The task force had chased a shadow for years. Now they faced the man. The evidence spoke in full sentences. DNA placed him there. Paint linked his world to theirs. His own words filled in the method. The Green River Killer had a legal name and a prison cell waiting. I end the page with a sentence that points toward the courtroom doors. The investigation had built the case. Now the sentencing would define the ending. I step into the courtroom without changing my pace. The state read charge after charge. The defense confirmed the plea. Families sat in rows, hands tight together, photographs of loved ones resting on their laps. Ridgway looked ordinary, which somehow made everything worse. Ordinary should not be able to do this. The twist was not a surprise confession. It was the size of the list. 48 names at first, then another. He admitted he had likely killed more than he could remember, over 70 by his own estimate, but the law would keep its number at what it could prove. The judge spoke of lives taken, communities damaged, justice owed. At first people thought sentencing would feel like a final door closing, but the shock of so many names made the room feel both full and hollow, full of grief, hollowed by absence. Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dozens of life sentences stacked end to end. No execution, no release. A long, quiet corridor leading to a locked end. He was sent away, and the courtroom exhaled because there was nothing left to say to him. He later helped identify additional remains, and another conviction was added. The number on paper rose to 49. The number in memory was larger. He once described why he chose his victims, because he thought no one would look hard for them. The cruelty of that calculation is a wound the city still carries. I close this section with the truth that leads to the last page. The case is solved, the man is caged, but the river still runs, and memory still returns to its banks. I end my diary with the clearest line I can write. The Green River Killer case is solved. Gary Ridgway pled guilty and is serving life without parole. The science that seemed too slow finally caught him. The paint from his workbench and the DNA he left behind outlived his lies. Seattle remembers. Families remember most. Advocacy grew from grief. More attention to missing persons who work the streets. Better coordination between agencies. Deeper respect for victims whose lives were too often ignored while they were alive. The case taught a city to count every life as equal, to push against the blind spots a killer exploited. So my diary closes where it began, by the river, with the names of those who should have come home. Justice arrived late, but it arrived. The man who hunted the vulnerable will never again touch the road he used like a weapon. What do you think? Did the case prove that patient science will always catch up? Or did luck, timing, and one man's arrogance play just as large a role? Tell me your view below. And if you want more diary-style true crime that moves step by step without skipping a beat, subscribe and stay with me, because the next story starts where this one leaves off, with a single clue that refuses to be quiet.